Welcome back, comrades. In my first video, I did a very basic overview of the differences between liberalism and socialism. And I also mentioned that socialism means different things to different people. So I figured I should go ahead and talk about that in this new video. While this certainly won't be an exhaustive list of the different socialist philosophies, I will get into quite a few of them, so I might end up taking a quantity over quality approach with this video. Let's get started. We'll begin with some of the more well-known names under the socialist umbrella. There is, of course, Marxism, which I discussed in my first video. As a quick refresher for those of you who haven't seen that video, Marxism was developed by German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the mid-19th century, as a way of analyzing human history through class struggle. In Marxist theory, socialism is a transitional phase between capitalist society and communist society, and is achieved after worldwide revolution by the working class to seize the means of production. Once the working class have seized control, the capitalist government would be replaced with what Marx and Engels called a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, unquote, in which the working class take control of the state. Over time, the state would, quote, wither away, unquote, leading to a communist society without money, private property, or a centralized state government. Marxism was the foundational political thought which motivated socialist-oriented revolutions in China and Russia, which then came to be known as the People's Republic of China and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, respectively. In Russia, Vladimir Lenin adapted Marxism to fit the material and political conditions of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. Lenin advocated for the utilization of a vanguard party of what he called, quote, professional revolutionaries, unquote, militant proletarians who would overthrow the royal family and capitalist bourgeoisie and seize control of the government and all industries in the form of worker-run Soviets. When Joseph Stalin seized power after Lenin's death in 1924, he modified Lenin's political theory, which he called Marxism-Leninism, to serve his own goals of achieving what would become known as socialism in one country. This became the dominant ideology in the USSR right up until Stalin's death in 1953. It should be noted that the very idea of socialism in one country seems to contradict Marx's position that socialism would need to be international in order to be accomplished and sustained in its ideal form. Meanwhile, in China, revolutionary leader Mao Zedong took similar measures to adapt Marxism-Leninism to the conditions in his own country. Because much of China was pre-industrial and agriculture was the primary source of labor, Maoism presented the field-working peasantry as the vanguard class of the revolution, rather than the urban-dwelling proletarians. Whereas Lenin viewed education of the revolutionaries in Marxist thought with great importance, Mao believed that this should be secondary to the physical praxis of the revolution, and that, quote, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, unquote. Maoism became the dominant political ideology of the Communist Party of China from the 1949 revolution until the late 1970s. Before I move on to some other forms of socialism, I do think that social democracy deserves a quick mention here. Since its foundation at the turn of the 20th century, social democracy has been a prevalent political ideology in Europe, and exerted some minor influence in the United States during the presidential administration of FDR. Social democracy, like Leninism and Maoism, was largely inspired by Marxism. However, its proponents advocated for a more revisionist approach to achieving a socialist form of government, generally through electoralism and government-funded social programs, rather than full-on revolution. In Germany, social democracy came to be seen by its critics on the left as a sort of concession of socialist principles in favor of capitalism, whereas its proponents, namely Edward Bernstein and Auguste Bebel, among others, viewed it as a more timely and pragmatic way of relieving the burdens carried by the working poor in an industrialized society. This divide was made sharper with the advent of the Russian Revolution, and the communist faction of the Social Democratic Party in Germany were later hunted down, leading to the assassination of socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg by the Social Democrat-led government in 1919. So, as you can imagine, social democracy has a less than favorable reputation among some socialist circles. Speaking of which, let's get back on track with socialism. One particular area in which socialists tend to differ is the idea of a centralized state versus a decentralized one, or the absence of a state altogether. Socialist tendencies which favor decentralization generally fall under the umbrella of libertarian socialism, also known as left libertarianism. Notable advocates of libertarian socialism include Murray Bookchin, Noam Chomsky, Oscar Wilde, and countless others. In the 20th century, trade unions were becoming a prominent force in left-wing social movements throughout the West, and out of this was born a form of decentralized socialism called syndicalism. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, "The hallmarks of syndicalism were workers' control and, quote, direct action," unquote. Syndicalists distrusted both the state, which they regarded as an agent of capitalism, and political parties, which they thought were incapable of achieving radical change. Their aim was to replace capitalism and the state with a loose federation of local workers' groups, which they meant to bring about through direct action, especially a general strike of workers that would bring down the government as it brought the economy to a halt, unquote. Guild socialism, which was popular in England in the early 20th century, shared similarities with syndicalism in that it advocated for power to be vested in worker unions. However, its proponents thought that the state should still exist if only to provide policing protection or coordination among guilds. In the United States, De Leonism, which was named for Socialist Labor Party leader Daniel De Leon, was another syndicalist ideology of note in the 1890s. However, De Leonism also incorporated the idea of a vanguard political party to help usher in a revolution, making De Leon an earlier proponent of vanguard socialism than Lenin himself. Anarcho-communism is another strain of socialism which favors not only decentralization, but total abolition of the state. One of its earliest proponents was Mikhail Bakunin, a Russian theorist who believed that, quote, "the passion for destruction is also a creative passion," unquote. As an anarchist, Bakunin agreed with Marx's vision of a communist society in which class, money, and the state were all abolished. However, he did not agree with Marx's theory that a dictatorship of the proletariat was a necessary phase in the transition from capitalism to communism. Peter Kropotkin, who also advocated for anarcho-communism, justified such a society by relating it to Darwin's theory of evolution, suggesting that the most successful species, in terms of evolution, were those that relied on cooperation with each other to survive. Another hallmark of debate among socialists is the dichotomy of free markets versus the planned economy. Throughout the 20th century, so-called Marxist governments, like those of the USSR and the People's Republic of China, have utilized a centrally planned economy in which the state determines quotas and outlines for production and infrastructure. In socialist thought, the antithesis to planned economies is market socialism. Market socialism is sometimes viewed as, quote, "a compromise between socialist planning and free enterprise, in which enterprises are publicly owned, but production and consumption are guided by market forces, rather than by government planning," unquote. Side note, I consider myself to be a market socialist, at least concerning non-essential goods and services. Yugoslavia, during the Cold War era, was arguably the most notable example of a socialist country incorporating some kind of free market into its policies. Under the leadership of Josip Tito from 1953 until 1980, Yugoslavia became infamous as a communist nation who, rather than being absorbed into Stalin's USSR, was determined to set its own course and remain an independent country in Eastern Europe. While Tito's government was centralized like other communist countries at the time, he was ideologically opposed to total state authority over the country's economics, and thus permitted a relatively free market, emphasizing worker-owned and controlled enterprises while avoiding overt capitalism and privatization of services. Obviously, this made for a less than friendly relationship with the USSR, but Yugoslavia still managed to forge alliances via the non-aligned movement with India under the leadership of Prime Minister Nehru and Egypt under the leadership of President Nasser. Alright, I sort of got off track there with that mini history lesson on the former Yugoslavia, so I apologize for that. Anyway, I wanted to close this video with a mention of eco-socialism, which is a strain of socialism that I might make a separate video on in the future. As you can probably tell from its name, eco-socialism places the welfare of the natural environment at the forefront, alongside the liberation of the working class from capitalist oppression. This is a notable difference from other groups within the larger so-called green movement in politics, which do not necessarily oppose capitalism. Eco-socialists tend to look at society from an ecological perspective, which actually led Murray Bookchin, a well-known voice in the realm of green anarchism, to coin the term social ecology in his writings. Again, this is another idea to which I could dedicate an entire video, so I'll just stop here for now. As always, I hope that you found this video to be relaxing, informative, or both. If so, please stay tuned for further content from this channel in the future. Until next time, comrades.